For almost 200 years, the Indian subcontinent was under British rule. And often, when we talk about this period, we hear about things like railways and a new administrative system. But the source material we're digging into today, well, it tells a much, much darker story. It's a story of systematic violence and a staggering economic drain. So let's unpack what really happened.
Okay, so to really get what happened, you gotta have a starting point, right? Let's go all the way back to the year 1700. Before British power really took hold, India's economy wasn't just big, it was a global powerhouse. This number, 27%, that was India's slice of the entire world economy. But fast forward to 1947, when the British left, and that economic dominance, it was completely gone. So the big question is, what on earth happened in those 2 centuries? The sources we're looking at argue it wasn't just a slow decline, it was a systematic dismantling. And here's where it landed. By the time India gained independence, its share of the world economy had crashed to just around 4%. That incredible drop, from 27 to 4, is really the backdrop for this entire story. And it starts with how control was kept in the first place.
So let's be really clear about something right up front. According to the sources, this empire wasn't built on handshakes and agreements. It was established and then maintained through brutal, overwhelming violence. The goal? To terrorize the population and absolutely crush any hint of resistance.
Let me paint a picture for you of one of the most infamous examples. Imagine it. It's April 13th, 1919, in the city of Amritsar. Thousands of people, men, women, children, they've all gathered for a peaceful protest inside a large walled garden. It's called Jallianwala Bagh. They're unarmed, and critically, they're trapped. There's really only one main way in or out.
And then, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer shows up with his troops. He blocks that single exit. He gives no warning. He just gives the order to open fire directly into that huge, dense crowd. His reported words make his intentions terrifyingly clear. Think about that for a second. For 10 solid minutes, his soldiers just fired, nonstop, into the screaming, panicked crowd. They fired 1,650 rounds. And they specifically aimed for the narrow exits where people were packed together, desperately trying to escape. The shooting only stopped for one reason. They ran out of ammunition.
But maybe the most revealing part of all this is what Dyer said himself afterwards. He stated that his goal wasn't just to disperse the crowd. He wanted to, in his words, produce a moral effect. The source is clear. The point was terror. He even ordered that the wounded be left there, refusing them any medical aid. And you have to understand, this Amritsar massacre, it wasn't some one-off tragic mistake. The source material documents a clear and brutal pattern. After the rebellion of 1857, there were mass executions, including the horrifying practice of blowing people from cannons. In 1872, 65 unarmed Sikh villagers were executed the same way, with no trial. And in 1913, troops turned machine guns on 1,500 tribal people. This was a playbook, a clear strategy. Rule by fear. Now, direct violence wasn't the only tool in the toolbox. The source material argues that some of the deadliest events to ever happen under British rule were famines, but these weren't natural disasters. They were man-made catastrophes, deliberately caused by specific government policies.
So let's take the Bengal famine of 1943. When you hear famine, what do you think? No rain, no crops, right? But here's the thing. The data shows 1943 actually had above-average rainfall. There was enough food in the region. So what caused it? Well, the research points to a series of British wartime policies. They confiscated local rice supplies, they continued exporting food from India, and they repeatedly turned down offers of international aid.
And the human cost of those decisions? It's just staggering. An estimated 3 million people starved to death in a famine that many scholars now argue was completely and totally preventable.
So you have to ask yourself, how could something like this be allowed to happen? This reported quote from the Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, gives us a pretty chilling glimpse into the mindset described in the source. When he was told about the millions dying, he allegedly blamed the Indians themselves, saying the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits.
And as horrifying as the Bengal famine was, it was just the last major one in a long, devastating trend. One study our source points to calculates that between just 1880 and 1920, colonial policies led to an estimated 100 million excess deaths in India. 100 million. It's a number that's almost impossible to even wrap your head around. Okay, so that leads us to the money, the economic engine that powered the whole empire.
The source describes a massive, systematic transfer of wealth from India straight to Britain. A process so huge, it even has its own name.
It's called the drain of wealth. And look, this wasn't just some random looting. This was a highly sophisticated financial mechanism designed to siphon resources out of India and pump them into Britain on an industrial scale for nearly 200 years.
So how did they pull this off? Well, you could call it a kind of legalized plunder. It works like this. First, the British collected taxes from the Indian people. Simple enough. Second, they used that very same tax money to buy Indian products like cotton, tea, and rice. Third, they exported all those goods out of India. But here's the brilliant, brutal trick. The payment for those exports, the profits, they never went back to India. They were kept in London. In essence, Britain was getting India's goods for free.
And the effect on India? Absolutely devastating. While Britain's Industrial Revolution was taking off, fueled by this massive injection of capital, India was being de-industrialized. Think about this. In 1750, India produced about a quarter of all the world's industrial stuff, especially textiles. They were world leaders. Fast forward to 1900, and that's collapsed to a tiny 2%.
So the big question is, what's the grand total? How much was actually drained over all that time? Well, according to research by the economist Utsa Patnaik, the total value of wealth siphoned out of India between 1765 and 1938 is estimated to be nearly $45 trillion in today's money. $45 trillion. It's a truly mind-bending figure.
So we've got violence, we've got policy-driven famines, we've got this massive economic drain. The last piece of the puzzle, as laid out in the source, is the political strategy that left behind a legacy of division and bloodshed, the policy of divide and rule. And you have to get this. It wasn't some accident of history. It was deliberate policy. The British actively fostered divisions to make the population easier to control. In 1905, they split the huge province of Bengal right down religious lines. In 1909, they created separate voting systems where Hindus could only vote for Hindus and Muslims for Muslims, literally writing division into the political DNA. All of this led to the final act in 1947, a chaotic, rushed withdrawal that tore the subcontinent in two. And when the British finally left, the result of this long-term strategy was a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. Communal violence just exploded across the new borders. As many as 2 million people were killed. 15 million were uprooted from their homes, creating one of the largest refugee crises in all of human history. The sources describe horrific scenes, trains arriving packed with dead bodies, entire villages just wiped off the map. This was the final, bloody chapter of British India.
So what's the takeaway here? The history presented in these sources isn't one of benevolent modernization. It's a history of ruthless economic extraction, of famines caused by policy, and of strategic, terrorizing violence. We see a nation go from a global economic leader to one crippled by poverty and torn apart by division. And it leaves us with a really fundamental question. How does confronting this history change our understanding of the world we've inherited? Of why some nations are wealthy, while others struggle, and the shape of the world we all live in?